This video will primarily be addressing the first half of The Mandalorian Season 3, and I'll also touch on Episode 5. So far, the season feels hollow to me for a multitude of different reasons, and the first one I want to go into is the overall arc that Mando has, or lack of one in Season 3. Through Seasons 1 and 2, we go from a ruthless bounty hunter who doesn't ask questions, to a more sympathetic father figure who cares for this youngling he has bonded to. In this time, you could kind of excuse some of the side quests for being fillery because, at the bare minimum, Grogu's and Mando's time together filled your interest. It gave Mando a solid arc and imbued him with an immense purpose because he had an important objective to achieve. Any obstacle along the way was also pretty fun because you had a lot of investment within this duo in getting to their end goal. Like when Grogu gets kidnapped, you immediately feel that gut punch and the drive to get him back is exciting. On top of the endpoint for this objective being inherently interesting because we get to meet a Jedi, along with there being a mystery as to who it will be. So from a plot basis and a character basis, Seasons 1 and 2 were able to keep you captivated. In Season 3, there hasn't been a strong and engaging throughline to hook you as a viewer, especially for the first 4 episodes where the plot meanders a lot with not much to look forward to. Mando doesn't really have any semblance of an arc so far, and his only objective was to bathe in the waters of Mandalore, which, in turn, this goal didn't really give him much to work with as a character, since he's just fulfilling some arbitrary objective to redeem himself. Once he achieves this goal, the show doesn't establish another objective for Mando. However, Episode 5 does a good job at partially rectifying this issue. Giving Mando the task of helping Navarro was pretty good, and I'm interested in seeing how this development evolves later on. Even though it feels like the writers are starting to set a precedence in that they aren't interested in giving Mando much character development. It seems like he's hit a point where he stayed the same since the end of Season 2. I wish they would explore him learning how to use the Darksaber more because that's by far the coolest aspect the show has set up, but yet it feels largely neglected. The creators seem to be shifting their focus towards Bo-Katan, which is fine to a degree, but this in turn leaves Mando out to dry. Now, you may be thinking that Mando doesn't need much deep character work, which is partially true. However, what made the earlier seasons so compelling was the bond between Mando and Grogu, and the amount of heart that came with that. So since that arc has been finished, there's a big void at the core of The Mandalorian that needs to be filled, and that hasn't in my opinion. I think they tried to refill that void by bringing back Grogu, but it feels very forced, and it's as if Disney panicked and brought him back as soon as possible. It seems like they didn't really understand what made him so special within the story, and now he's mostly here to be cute and play paintball. To me, it would make the most sense that the original plan for the show was to have Grogu exit permanently after Season 2, or at worst, coming back after Season 3, because by bringing him back so soon, it diminishes that strong farewell, which was by far the highest point in the show, and I don't know if they'll ever be able to get to that level of quality again. To make things even worse, they included Grogu's return in the Book of Boba Fett, which was just a wild decision. Having such a huge development for Mando not in his own show is baffling to me, especially since those 2 episodes of The Mandalorian within the Book of Boba Fett were far meatier than what we've gotten in most of Season 3 so far. So I feel bad for the casual viewers who were confused when Grogu was back because they didn't even explain it in the recap. But yeah, Grogu's place in the show feels artificial and seems like he's just there because Disney didn't want to take a hit in merchandise sales. I can't shake the feeling that the original plan for Season 3 was a Bo-Katan and Mando arc without Grogu. I think it would have been much better if they solely paired these 2 characters together because what's happening to Bo right now is kind of interesting, albeit it's pretty underdeveloped so far considering how short the episodes have been. The writers really need to write more dialogue scenes and commit to actual character development because the little screen time we've had is mostly reserved for action, which is fun, but you can only get so far with spectacle. On top of also spending a ton of time exploring characters like Dr. Pershing, the fact that he's gotten significantly more character work in comparison to our main hero is insane from a writing perspective. The episodes are essentially averaging 30-ish minutes, and with an additional 10 minutes of time focusing on characters an episode, it would feel a lot better. That's what the standard should be for these kinds of shows, especially since there are only 8 episodes. This is about the same amount of content in the past, but since we are lacking certain elements like solid objectives and character work, along with other things I'll bring up later in the video, it feels like we're receiving less value from each episode. Because of this lack of care being put into the script lengths, I'm feeling more and more detached from Mando and it feels like he's fading away. I also hate how they are kind of knocking down his character to have Bo repeatedly save him, like in episode 2. Him blindly walking into an aquifer while also taking off his jetpack was really silly to me. I think there can definitely be a better execution for their pairing, in which you treat them more as equals. Or at the very least, have Mando actively progress to a point where he matches Bo's level, along with giving him a complementary arc so that he's not aimlessly following her around. There may just be 8 episodes, but this is something that is necessary for storytelling. Another remedy would be to reduce Grogu's time in the show and allocate that time to other characters. A lot of his moments are starting to feel more like fan service instead of progressing any form of relationship or the story. An example being the paintball scene. Unless if they are developing Grogu into becoming a Mandalorian or something, which would just be ridiculous, then him training here is not necessary for the plot. Cutting out Grogu in general isn't currently attainable since he's already back, but they really need more scenes between Mando and Bo. And dialogue that isn't solely driven by lore like in episode 2, because it felt like Bo was a tour guide in that episode. Also, by leaving Grogu out of the season, it shakes up the status quo of the show, and it forces the writers to get creative and not rely on Grogu's cuteness. And the thing is that the setting for most of the season is within this group of Mandalorians, so the recipe is already shaken up, and the writers have to utilize that fact more. I'd much rather have scenes of the Mandalorians telling stories and talking to each other, rather than Grogu having more PTSD flashbacks. Or hell, even establishing more Mandalorian characters because it's a pretty sparse roster right now. All we have is the armorer lady and this big dude, and that's it. If we had a few other characters to look to within the ranks of the Mandalorians, this group would be much more interesting and you could spawn more dialogue scenes naturally, thus growing your characters. I feel like a golden opportunity to add in a scene with a bit of character development would have been during the dinner scene by the fire in episode 4. They could have easily included some dialogue before they started eating, and instead, the writers end it quickly by passing out food and everyone leaves. The thing that stings even more is that this episode is only 26 minutes long, and if you cut out the Grogu flashback, which felt redundant, given that we learned about that in season 2 and by seeing all of it, it doesn't add much to the story, the episode would have been 22 minutes long. So it feels like Jon Favreau, who's the sole writer of season 3 so far, is not putting enough time and care into the scripts. And he's been the primary writer for both The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett, so I'm starting to think that he's the one that's probably at fault. If there's anyone to blame for the botchery of the Book of Boba Fett, it would be Jon Favreau because those scripts were dog shit. I'm sorry, but they were. The Mandalorian Season 3 is starting to show its cracks, and the lack of expansion overall and evolution of Mando is hindering the show. Because the fact that we are 5 episodes in, and we had a beginning episode that was absolutely pointless, given that Mando just gets some other random droid instead of the one he wanted on Navarro, episode 3 primarily following characters who aren't relevant to the current plot, and episode 4, which is 22 minutes without the flashback, is starting to show some worrying signs for the writing. Episode 5 is giving me some hope, but I'm afraid that this sudden burst of productivity in the plot will be met with 2 episodes where barely anything happens. When other shows like The Last of Us have more character and plot development in a single episode than half of your season, then you need to provide more content. Not to mention the fact that there's been a 3-year time gap between seasons 2 and 3. It's crazy to me that season 2 was back in 2020. We're getting old, man. So the amount of content and quality that we are getting feels rough. I know we've gotten lots of side quest episodes in the past, but at the very least, they are motivated by a general objective. And there was even an overarching villain presence within the first 2 seasons. Moff Gideon was a menacing character who was always operating in the background to apply pressure to our characters, and the stormtroopers that Mando occasionally ran into felt like an extension of Moff Gideon's power. In season 3, that villain threat is Gorian Shard, and it's obviously a major step down, but he is a short-term villain. The biggest issue with Gorian is that his presence at this point in the show relies on a major contrivance. Firstly, him having a form of peace with Navarro is kind of weird because pirates aren't known for making peace. They do whatever they want and raid whatever they want. Then secondly, the fact that Greef Karga has no defenses on Navarro and has the audacity to say this.
Sure you want to let him go?
You'll let it be known that Navarro is respectable now, and not to be trifled with.
You literally just gunned down a bunch of pirates, which will undoubtedly antagonize their leader. And what the hell is stopping him from raiding Navarro now? There are zero defenses, and Greef Karga I guess just hopes that Gorian won't attack his city, because nothing is stopping him. It's also funny how Greef only sends out a notice for help until they get attacked, and doesn't bother with any safety precautions for if Gorian does attack. It's just a very stupid scenario and is only this way so that Mando can get the help of the Mandalorians to save the day. So this brief villain threat was not great, and I feel like people are loving this so much right now because we are finally getting some form of progression. Despite this being the 5th episode in the season and there are only 3 left now. Hopefully Jon Favreau will start applying some pressure towards our heroes since they finally announced that Moff Gideon escaped. At this point, if any character doesn't die on screen in Star Wars, they are guaranteed to come back. Or even if they do die, then they have a high chance of coming back too. But hopefully Moff's return will spawn a more consistent through line of conflict that'll make future obstacles more engaging. If I had to guess, they'll probably reserve his appearance for a finale cliffhanger and will slow down the pace for the next couple of episodes. I do hope I'm wrong though. Overall, most of the season has a lack of purpose and objective. Development for our main character feels non-existent, the villain presence is lacking, and the return of Grogu is cheap and detracts from the story at this point. I know there are still 3 episodes left and the show can turn around, so I'm reserving my final judgment for an overall review when the season ends. As a side note, I'm on the fence about continuing the Baby Yoda Boat with Subtitles series. I feel like I should since they are really popular, but it feels weird because I haven't made those videos in a while, so we'll see. Regardless though, thank you for watching, and let me know in the comments what you think about the Mandalorian Season 3 so far.